Section 5.1, multiplication and division with rational expressions. In this section, we're going to use what we have learned before, where we need to factor our problem, and then we can multiply or divide. A rational expression is just going to be a fraction that contains a polynomial. So for example, these two fractions are examples of rational expressions. The first step is to look at your problem and factor every single part that is factorable. We'll start with the first fraction. This is a difference of two squares, but it's written backwards. And most of the time, if the problem is written backwards, then you need to factor out a -1. So most of the time, that's going to help. So let's first factor out -1 from the numerator. So that's going to look like this. And that's going to change the sign. For x squared, it'll make x squared positive, and for negative. We can factor this trinomial. And the second fraction we can't factor, so we recopy. We also need to go back and factor this difference of squares. Make sure you carry down -1. And I'm going to move the -1 and put it in front of the fraction. That way we don't have to worry about it anymore. Once everything is completely factored, then we can reduce, and you can reduce up and down, and you can also cross cancel, meaning one at the top and one at the bottom for the fractions, for in this case the fraction, the first fraction and the second fraction. So we can reduce and also x plus 2. And then we just write what we're left with, and you just multiply across. So it's just -1 times 3, and that's going to give us -3 over x minus 2. So we can write our answer a few ways. Remember, when you have a fraction, the negative sign can go in the numerator. The negative sign can go in the middle of the fraction, so I'm going to also include or. We can write negative and then 3 over x minus 2. That's also acceptable. You can also put the negative sign in the denominator, but because we have a binomial in the denominator, you need to use parentheses. These are all equivalent. You just need to have one of these on your paper. So again, the negative sign can go with the numerator, it can go in the middle of the fraction, or it can go in the denominator. Let's take a look at the second example. This is an example where we have to divide two fractions. And just remember that to divide two fractions, we always change division to multiplication and write the reciprocal of the second fraction. We are going to start off by factoring every single part. Also notice that the numerator is written backwards, so we should factor out a -1. That will probably help us when we reduce later. So let's factor out -1 first. And remember, when you factor out -1, it changes all the signs. I'll start with the first term, and we just put these in order. And from here, I can just factor the denominator. And at the same time, I can multiply by the reciprocal of the second fraction. Since it's the reciprocal, we need to factor the trinomial right here in the denominator. That's going to go in the numerator. And then we factor the binomial here. And the last thing we have to do is factor the trinomial that's left. Make sure you bring down -1. That's part of your answer. So factoring this trinomial, once everything is factored, then we can reduce. So let's see what we can reduce here. We can reduce 2x plus 3. We can reduce 5x minus 2. We can also reduce x minus 1. And so in the numerator, we're left with -1 times 3x minus 2. And in the denominator, we're left with x squared. Since we have this -1, you can put that negative in the numerator, in the middle of the fraction, or in the denominator. I will just leave it in the middle of our fraction. Remember that if you want to write the negative in the numerator, you have to use parentheses because we have a binomial. So if you want, we could do that as well. And the third possibility looks like this. These are all equivalent. You just need one for your answer.